Good evening, everyone, and welcome to it's the second in the Arnhold Forum lectures. And I'm not going to do the Arnhold Forum introduction. I'm going to leave that to Will, and he's going to introduce Jed Purdy. I'm really just thankful to have a few minutes at the beginning to say a couple of words to Jed, who I've long wanted to meet in person, and we've exchanged communication over the years. But this is the first chance that I've had to hear him speak in person, and I'm so thrilled that you're here. I first read Jed's work back in 2015 when After Nature, Politics for the Anthropocene came out, and I was telling Will, very excitedly sharing this text with my colleague deans at the time. Like, you gotta read this, right? Because those of you who know me, my work is in climate change. Architect is in my background. But Jed's work was putting into perspective and into a language that I felt was so important for the communication of the urgency of what was in front of us. And there's this, and so of course I started assigning the work to my students, and it shows up in a class on waste and justice. But there's this wonderful line in one of the last chapters of the book from 2015 in which he says, "Democracy has not been doing well." This is a decade ago. And for this reason, now is an awkward time to argue that it must be the fulcrum of the Anthropocene. And I thought, well, if somebody's not being prescient,
premature,
maybe premature, I don't know. But it as an architect working in the space, and speaking again of premature or working slowly, the field that I work in, both as a practitioner and as a scholar, is an incredibly slow moving one, and change comes to it rarely and slowly, and so Jed's work has been an incredible gift and an inspiration to generations of students at the New School, at least those that have been in my class, and to practitioners and scholars working in this space. And so I am deeply, deeply grateful that you are here with us today, and I will let Will Milberg do the formal introduction, but I just wanted to offer that.
Joel, thank you so much. Thank you, Joel. Beautiful. And Joel has spoken to me about Jed Purdy many times. So when I asked him to say a few words, I said, no preparation necessary. Just tell us what you've been telling me over the years. And thank you for that. It is Earth Day, believe it or not. We had Jim Miller and I, who have begun to organize this Arnhold Forum, and thank you, Jim. We had actually to plan for years to have Professor Jed Purdy speak here on Earth Day. It was like, Jim's laughing. He knows that it was lucky. It is crazy that Professor Purdy has not spoken before at the New School. He is a rare intellectual who combines many fields that we cherish at the New School: the confluence of political theory and philosophy, concerns with democracy, markets and their limits, all applied to questions of the environment and the Anthropocene, with very careful consideration of his major field, which is law, property, and constitutionalism, all brought together in deep academic work and, remarkably, in popular, accessible form, with a focus on the moment, culturally, economically, and most important, politically. So the one question I have is, why does this guy not already teach at the New School? Jed Purdy teaches law at Duke Law School, where he is the Raphael Lemkin Professor from 2019 to 2022. He was the William Beinecke Professor at Columbia Law, so he's now at Duke Law. He is the author of 7 books: After Nature, A Politics for the Anthropocene, This Land is Our Land, The Struggle for a New Commonwealth, and Two Cheers for Politics, Why Democracy is Flawed, Frightening, and Our Best Hope. His writing on constitutional law, environmental law, the law of property, legal theory has appeared in Yale Law Review, Harvard Law Review, Columbia Law Review, many others. He has published essays and reviews in places including The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Nation, Dissent Magazine, New York Times op-ed page, N+1, and he is a member of the board of Dissent Magazine. He is a native of West Virginia, and he lives outside Durham, North Carolina with his family. Tonight's lecture is part of the Henry H. Arnhold Forum on Global Challenges. Last week we had really a brilliant panel discussion of the dismantling of the administrative state with a comparison of US, Hungary, and China. And Jim and I have started to plan programming for the fall. We will have Eddie Glaude from Princeton University speaking on race and American democracy. And we are planning a performance with the Performing Arts School at the New School of Fandango at the Wall by our own jazz musician Arturo O'Farrell, working in combination with a group of jazz musicians from Tijuana, Mexico, with whom Arturo performs regularly. So the theme of this year's Arnhold Forum is Challenges to Democracy, a topic on which Purdy has written extensively. And I just want to mention briefly two of his works that I hope we hear more about tonight. After Nature, we learn that nature no longer exists apart from humanity. And as Purdy writes, the world we will inhabit is the one we have made. Geologists call this the epoch of the Anthropocene, age of humans. The facts of the Anthropocene are scientific, but its shape and meaning are questions for politics, end quote. So the environment, the post-human vision, becomes a foundation for thinking about the political, for thinking about a democratic future. I understand, and I don't know the details, that the NSSR is planning a very exciting sounding MA program in climate futures. For Purdy, such futures are inextricably political futures. A review of his book After Nature in Harper's Magazine wrote, quote, After Nature, the book, argues that we will deserve the future only because it will be the one we made. We will live or die by our mistakes. And the last chapter of that book is called What Kind of Democracy? So the book is After Nature, and the last chapter is What Kind of Democracy? And it's an appeal for post-humanist politics, quote, of the moral importance of landscapes and climates, of the permeable line between human and the rest of the living world. I want to just mention one other book and then turn it over to tonight's speaker, Two Cheers for Democracy. The goal of the book is, to quote Professor Purdy, to make the commitment to democracy more mature and stable, or as he argues, deeper. It's not that democracy as such is failing, he suggests, but we who are failing to be democratic enough, or democratic in the right ways. He denounces, by the way, the revolt against democracy on January 6th, 2021. But he's also critical of what he calls the anti-democratic anachronisms of the US government, the Supreme Court, the Electoral College, and even the party system, and posits that the US Constitution itself, quote, may be the enemy of the democracy it supposedly sustains. On economy, in a series of passages that made a lot of sense to this economist, Purdy writes that, quote, democracy, even liberal capitalist democracy, needs protection from the market. Our capitalist economy bends politics to its shape. So in an age of intellectual specialization, amidst a specter of suppression of academic freedom, suppression even of language, Jed Purdy is a gem, someone which we should listen to carefully. His voice reminds us of the essential role of intellectual life in a democracy, and I am very pleased to welcome Jed Purdy on Earth Day 2025 as this year's Arnhold Forum lecturer. Please welcome Jed.
You got it.
Thank you so much. I have been trying to assemble my thoughts for weeks now. Sometimes when one puts together a talk of this kind, the result may be architectural. This feels to me more like one of those maps they can now produce of where an animal has been in its wanderings across the landscape, in and out of ravines, over the ridges, down into the shadows. It gets bleak in places, but it's not bleak for its own sake. It is very much an effort to think with and in the face of a moment in which, as I was saying to Will earlier, it sometimes feels as if it's impossible to say enough, and yet it is also impossible to know where to begin and in what direction to face. So we'll start.
Excuse me, can you speak into the microphone so that the other?
Yes. Okay, good. I'll speak into the microphone. Would it be better? Yeah. Yeah.
You want to do your
I think what I'm going to do. This is not a concert. What do you think? Look, I just think put something up here that's big enough to have 2 pages out.
There you go.
That way I can stand to speak to you. Well, thank you. That's
You got it. And
yeah.
turn this on.
That's perfect. This way I'm
I think we're gonna put this here though.
great. That's
Okay.
great.
Good luck.
Perfect. Thank you. That's much better. That way I'm not hiding behind the screen. And does this work all right for great, thank you. So I want to trace the outline of an era that's closed. It ran from roughly the end of the Cold War until now, though it's been in crisis for nearly a decade. Its basic logic took shape in the 1990s, but it reached its apex in the first decade of the 21st century. It was an era of uniquely dominant American power, military, economic, cultural. The U.S. decided when and where to go to war, including portentously in Iraq in 2002. Wherever you went in those years, from Egypt to India to Indonesia, young people would tell you that they expected the future to be a certain kind of American world. Even in China, which very much had a sense of its own place on the global stage, I remember walking into a Shanghai bookshop in 2001 to encounter an exhibition of an audio program for learning English, which was repeating the useful phrase, "We're looking forward to the closer trading relationship." It amazes me that this is true. The working assumption of that era was that history had a direction, glimpsed in the audiobook I just quoted. The direction was toward liberal democracy, and the road to it was the global extension of market life. Whether or not we knew it, we were all looking forward to the closer trading relationship. Global media would remind people of what they wanted, personal liberty and nice things. After all, the story went, the Soviet Empire had fallen because its people wanted blue jeans and rock and roll. Markets would bring those things, and participation in markets would shape people into liberal and democratic citizens. Why? Because as entrepreneurs, small property holders, people with jobs and a stake in the system, they would demand security, stability, and personal rights from their governments. Regimes around the world would become more responsive and more responsible. Ultimately, we would all be democratic. But, and here was a paradox, we might hardly notice the difference democracy made. Democracy is a system of collective choice, a way of choosing a future. But in the climate of thought that I'm recalling, there was only one desirable future. All democracies would get to more or less the same place with different details, which were not much more important than national costumes, local cuisines, or preferred holidays. Democracy would put a final stamp of approval on the world that markets and human nature were already building. This description suggests a complacency and sense of inevitability, which is partly false. There was also a deliberate political effort to build the world order in which this theory of democratic development would thrive. This was global economic integration on market terms. First, lowering barriers at the border, especially tariffs and capital controls, then pressing towards standardization of domestic regulation and the building of a transnational dispute resolution system to give investors their own private legal sphere where mere national sovereignty wouldn't intrude. This is what we now call globalization. We should identify it more precisely as a specific program of globalizing market relations as a path to viable world order. There was plenty of money to make in all of this, but it was also a geopolitical gamble. Its vision of world order was that countries integrated in this fashion would not go to war abroad and would not undercut their own democratic and liberal orders at home. They would be too interdependent and too sensible for such self-inflicted disasters. So we live in an era that was built on a theory of modern political economy. The theory comes in two parts. First, the French du commerce, translated roughly as sweet commerce, that market economies take the edge off human psychology and social life, make everyone more rational, more prudent, more inclined to seek stability. Second, commercial peace theory. Basically, that du commerce scales up to the national and international levels, partly because national politics is driven by citizens who are prudent and sensible, partly because political and economic elites understand that open conflict would wreck an architecture of interdependence that everyone needs. Think of global supply chains or the stability of international investments. The political science of this era argued that once countries reached a certain level of economic growth and held a certain number of successful elections, they would not go back. They were what political scientists called consolidated democracies, and they would not deconsolidate themselves. I don't think you need me to remind you of all the ways that this theory has been shaken. We are not living in the future that it proposed. The current relationship between democracy and ecology took shape in the shadow of this theory. In addition to what I've said, it was widely accepted that there was one existential challenge to consolidated democracies, which they would have to rally to meet. This was climate change. Climate change had a double face because it was an existential challenge that also seemed to fit perfectly within the intellectual framework of the time. It was the great exception to economic logic, but an exception that could be understood entirely in the dominant economic terms. So it seemed to confirm the larger logic rather than call it into question. The standard analysis of climate change, as you no doubt know, ran like this. Economic citizens, who were otherwise the prudent models of du commerce, nonetheless burned fossil fuels like there was no tomorrow, because their emissions were externalities, harms for which they didn't have to pay. And this problem scaled up globally. Every country rationally produced externalities for the rest of the world. In the intellectual life of the time, in policy schools and think tanks and law schools, there was a certain aesthetic pleasure in the logic of climate crisis. It was a terrible problem, but it made so much sense. And there was a solution embedded in the same way of thinking. If the problem was externalities, a bug in the pricing system of markets, then the cure was to patch the code. So for roughly 2 decades, the overriding concern of respectable thinking about climate change was how to put a price on carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions. The big question was whether the price should take the form of a carbon tax or of tradable emissions permits. Once the price was there, the theory went, the whole economy would pivot to a green transition. There would be enhanced returns to investment in energy, consumer decisions would reflect the true cost of emissions, and du commerce would also be green commerce. The idea had a mostly unexamined institutional context. First was its audience. It was never a popular political program, but a technical project directed to a responsible, public-spirited lawmaker. So it needed that lawmaker to exist. In that sense, it involved a big implicit gamble on democracy itself, a version of democracy that was at once bold and strong enough for a fundamental reworking of the economy, and humble and technocratic enough to take dictation from economics-minded policy specialists. But of course, that was how trade liberalization had gone, or seemed to be going, so it was in some ways a natural extension. Second was the idea that this policymaker would be able to shape not just the national economy, but the world order. A patch to the national economy that raised the cost of doing business would be just a self-imposed economic wound unless other countries were on board. But in a period in which an international rules-based economic order was expanding and pressing its logic behind borders, this ambition seemed plausible. A later version of the same goal would focus on shaping the investment policies of the biggest financial actors in the US and Europe, on the theory that they were effectively institutions of governance that could reset priorities in the direction of a green transition. Again, I don't think I need to remind you of all the ways that these assumptions have been shaken. In this new world, missed opportunities become clear in hindsight. During more than a decade of vanishingly low interest rates, in a time of relative peace, the US did not invest aggressively in an energy transition, but waited for re-engineered market signals to do the job, and not even the re-engineering emerged. We have remembered belatedly that the way to set a direction in national development is through large public investment in key infrastructure and technology. The Biden administration tried to make up lost ground under the unfavorable conditions of higher interest rates and a tiny and fleeting congressional majority, but time ran out. I said earlier that we got here under a specific theory of political economy, which did not turn out to be a good compass. The world in which a vision of climate policy arose, the one I've described, and fell, was threaded through with a theory of what democracy and capitalism mean in relation to each other. Capitalist markets would promote peace, promote and secure democracy, but also keep it in its place, keep its ambitions within reasonable limits. In our time, when that compass seems to have failed, one direction is to learn from other theories of political economy, other ways of thinking about the relationship between democracy and capitalism. Like some members of the New School faculty whom I admire, I've learned from the economic historian Karl Polanyi, who argued that the laissez-faire market tends to undercut the conditions of its own success by treating as commodities things it needs, which will break down or collapse if they are produced and exploited based on return to private investment. Polanyi's key examples of what he called false commodities were land, labor, and money. To update the thought for each, from money, consider the prospects of financial crisis that we face in a world where money is, on the one hand, the essential infrastructure of economic world order, and on the other hand, a wild west of crypto ventures. We've already lived once through the kind of systemic lockup that can happen when reckless private investment engineering interacts with key financial flows. That was the 2008-9 financial crisis, the watershed still of much of today's world disorder. But it could be so much worse. For labor, continuing with Polanyi's typology, think of the essential work on social reproduction that Nancy Fraser has done here at the New School. How do we keep the human world going when nearly everything we need has a price? Food, shelter, medicine, often education, that having and raising children is treated as a free input to the system. We can update Polanyi's land to ecology and see much of our environmental crisis as what happens when the non-human world is an object of profit-making, but without care for the conditions in which its systems can continue to thrive, whether we're talking about the soil of Iowa, the water of the American West, or the global atmosphere's processing of carbon and other greenhouse gases. I would add two other false commodifications. The first is law. Consider a part of what held together the optimism about market-based climate policy. It was a certain image of how market actors relate to the framework of law in which they operate. In this image, market actors fight tooth and nail for advantage within the terms of authorized competition. But this rule-bound war of all against all stops at the boundaries of the authorized marketplace. So if policymakers change the rules, Exxon, for instance, will turn its efforts to hydrogen fuel research and negotiations with Saudi Arabia over placement of solar arrays. But today it's easy to say what was once scandalous. Market actors don't want competition. They want regulatory rents, platform monopoly, employment market oligopsony, and all the other advantages that Peter Thiel had in mind when he announced that competition is for losers. The logic of competitive markets is not necessarily to respect the legal boundaries that set the terms and limits of competition. but precisely to treat the rules themselves as objects of investment, meaning law is less likely to serve as the means for democratic and technocratic judgments that temper market order, more likely to be the place where market actors try to hack out new paths to dominance. In other words, in Polanyi's terms, law gets produced as an object of private investment, and when this is true, its ability to provide an independent, stabilizing, and organizing framework is undercut. The other false commodification that I would add here is the commodification of culture or of social imagination. Democracy in a vast and complex society depends intensely on imagination, on the atlas of the world that we carry in our heads. You can have largely the same day-to-day experience, the same concrete interactions, and at the same time broadly believe either that others are your fellow humans and your fellow Americans to whom you're bound in loyalty and affection, or that you live under siege by people who want to tear down everything that you hold dear. Less dramatically, we can understand our elections as collective decisions only because we carry overlapping pictures in our heads of what's at stake when we check one name or the other on a ballot. So we have to ask, I'm using a couple of examples to try to make a very large point, which is that to act in relation to a collective is always to imagine the collective. It's always to have a picture of the world in your head. We just can't proceed otherwise. So little of what we have to assume and act on is on the basis of direct experience. Everything is in some way a product of what we've taken on trust and made out of the inferences of our experience. So we have to ask how our imagination is produced and reproduced, as we might ask about law or ecological health. A key part of the answer is in how we communicate. And if imagination seems ephemeral, communication is very material. For decades, the sense of the world outside one's own immediate experience came to a very great degree from broadcast television and print that tended to create a broadly consensual view of the world for reasons that were both technological and regulatory. It was during the same period that political scientists concluded that so-called consolidated democracies were basically immune from backsliding into undemocratic politics. The eclipse of that optimism about democratic stability has come along with the eclipse of those forms of consensus fostering communication. Now democracy seems unstable and fragmenting, even as the technologies that mediate our communication and shape our imagination have become fragmenting, ways of multiplying worldviews and setting them against one another. Anyone who's been active on social or partisan media, as I used to be, knows that although we express our own opinions and absorb those of others, we don't choose the conditions in which we do so. And algorithms and group dynamics change the conversation and change us. And we know that these dynamics all take place within a larger economy in which the commodification of attention proceeds by activating feelings of fear and resentment and anxiety and vanity, which make it feel reckless to look away, and so keep us exactly where our efforts at civic dialogue contribute the most to the return on the investment of platform owners. I don't mean to say, in a paranoid spirit, that we're in the matrix. I don't mean to deny that people know things and reason about what we know, but I do mean that how we imagine our world matters essentially to our politics, and it changes as the means of communication change. The way we communicate is in part how we create the pictures of the world in which we necessarily act, and those too we produce now in the pursuit of return on investment, and we conduct our culture within platforms in media generated and structured on those terms. I suspect that the commodification of culture is a contributor to the collapse of trust in public institutions and in other people. That collapse, I pause over here because it makes deep constructive political change on democratic terms much harder. It is even conceivable that it puts it out of reach. It highlights how much democracy relies on the intangible cohesion, trust, a force that, like gravity, holds us together, but which we can hardly sense before it begins to fail. When the great modern environmental laws were passed by overwhelming congressional majorities between 1970 and 1973, about 60% of Americans said that they trusted the government, that's how the question was posed, to do what was right all or most of the time. 60%. That was already down from more than 75%. 75% in the mid-1960s. But it's still remarkable in hindsight. Coming out of a decade of war, domestic terror, and riots, large majorities of Americans said they solidly believed in their core political institutions. Today, the comparable figure is about 22%. That's languished in that level for going on 2 decades. During the same period, Americans' self-reported trust in other individuals has also collapsed. Although it was never as high as trust in institutions, more than 50% of Americans thought when the big environmental laws were passed that other people were basically trustworthy. Today, that number is about 30%, at its lowest among young people who are extremely likely to say that they believe others will take advantage of you if they get the chance. What does it have to do with democracy? Democracy relies on trust to a special degree, and not for sentimental reasons, for very practical reasons. In it, we put ourselves in one another's hands. I think this is a moment in which we can't but be aware of this. Who would do that? Who would put themselves in the hands of others that they thought corrupt and untrustworthy, people they thought were likely to take advantage of them? I don't think this feels like an entirely hypothetical question. It's no surprise, I would say. Well, let me pause, actually. I would say just now, the shrinking and even the dismantling of parts of the federal government, although they are in a sense dramatic public action, seem to confirm this condition of disaffection. In a time of widespread cynicism and mistrust, it is possible to unmake institutions, to break customs and norms and even constitutional rules that once seemed permanent. There remains plenty of power in government that can be turned against enemies and in favor of friends. But this is different from the broadly consensual making of a common world. I'm not sure that is in our reach today. And that has been very important in the history of ecological politics, when it has been most successful and most generative in this country. That's what I want to talk about next. I won't try to say what comes next in our politics. I think uncertainty is the basic fact about our political moment, uncertainty and danger. What I want to do instead is to set out some of the qualities that have often defined ecological politics, and which were largely missing from the 2 decades of climate-focused politics that I've been describing. The point of this exercise in memory is that I suspect we might want to seek ways to recover some of those qualities. First, ecological politics has often been about world-making. In the United States, the creation of the Sierra Club and other long-lasting organizations, and the broader history of mobilization around the human relationship to the natural world, both began in a constructive politics of landscape. Between the Sierra Club's founding in the 1890s and the passage of the Federal Wilderness Act in 1964, arguably the defining goal of environmental politics was to preserve and, by deliberate management, to produce certain kinds of terrain. Think of the cathedral-like spires of Yosemite Valley, framing its almost pastoral lowland meadows, or the big slopes and the endless forest of the Adirondacks. Part of the purpose of these landscapes was civic. They formed a commons. They physically represented the common ground of civic membership. They provided a place where anyone had a right to be. In this role, they resembled urban parks and promenades, public libraries, and universities. They were sometimes called by their advocates Republican parks, meaning places of recreation and rest for a free, self-governing country, in contrast to the royal and aristocratic parts of Europe. Public spaces like Yosemite were also places to cultivate a certain mode of experience. People went there to connect their own lives with a bigger order of being. It was a romantic idea that in wild places you could become more yourself, because nature was a kind of spiritual home. Here, a literary idea became a political program. It became an agenda of state and federal land law to make places in which this kind of experience, glimpsed in Wordsworth and Thoreau and Emerson and so many others, could flourish, embodied, lived. Today we have 83 million acres of national parks and 112 million acres of designated federal wilderness, each park and wilderness area established by an act of Congress. That's about 8% of the land area of the country dedicated to a politics of almost utopian experience, of romantic experience. And there's been a lot of writing about the limitation and problems of this history. Its elite and sometimes elitist profile, the involvement of some of its major figures in eugenics and theories of racial hierarchy. I've done some of that writing, so obviously I think it's important. But I also think that in making these appropriate qualifications and criticisms, we risk losing track of the distinctive power of this kind of politics, its power to shape a world and help call into being ways of seeing, of feeling, and of being together. It seems to me that we need these. We know we need them, and that we're at something of a loss for how to create them. The misleadingly named Inflation Reduction Act, the Biden administration's major energy and environmental legislation, aimed at a green transition based on an environmental politics that can build solar arrays, a better energy grid, charging stations for electric vehicles. Now, this move to building infrastructure was, to my mind, the most promising direction in environmental politics in decades. And I'm gravely disappointed, both by the ways it was hobbled in its own terms, almost no charging stations were built, and by the ways it's now being pressed back by political opposition. But the odd thing about infrastructure, especially energy infrastructure, is how it aspires to invisibility, to be the background of experience. We tend to notice it only when it fails, when a natural disaster imposes a terrifying thought experiment. How long can we go without power? How long can we go without water? How far can we drive before we run out of fuel? Until that moment, who even sees the power lines? Infrastructure policy usually lacks, though it could certainly use, what I've been calling a politics of experience, a spirit of world making. And I've been arguing that this spirit has not been an eccentric or an elite part of ecological politics. It's often been a beating heart. Another major theme in the history of ecological politics has been the meaning of the non-human world. In saying meaning, I'm being deliberately broad. This theme cuts across ethics, aesthetics, and the relationship between knowledge of others and the knowledge of oneself. It's Henry Thoreau asking the pawn, "Walden, is it you?" and getting no answer except for everything that he recounted in the book that he named for the pawn. It's also Thoreau watching the spring melt the earth in a railroad cut between his shack and the village of Concord, and falling into a vision in which he sees his own body in the rivulets of dirty water, in the newly loosened soil, and in the structure of a first green leaf, and he imagines the stems of that leaf are the joinery of his hands, and the joinery of his hands were also the branching tributaries of a great river. This kind of aspiration to see ourselves and to come to see ourselves differently by seeing ourselves in life outside of and different from us is one source of the idea, which informed the Wilderness Act with its 112 million acres, that our self-knowledge as individuals and as a culture depends on relationships with what's beyond us and strange to us. This idea also helped to power the Endangered Species Act, which 52 years ago established something like a legal right to exist for species, including a prohibition on killing individual members of threatened or endangered species, and a requirement that federal actions respect the critical habitat of those species. Biodiversity is often shoehorned into arguments about economic benefit. Who knows what medicines we might synthesize from some plant? And that's fine, but there's another powerful register of political motivation, which starts not by asking what we can get from the non-human world, but what it is, and what we are in relation to it. We're here among other beings, some of them wildly different from us. What changes when we grasp this, when we genuinely appreciate it? How far can we genuinely appreciate it? When it comes to understanding human politics. The essential starting point is that other people really are other. We know that someone who sees other people as aspects of oneself can be cunning and effective, but in the end will be confused and dangerous. You'll have your own examples in mind. I'm thinking of mine. Can we extend this thought beyond the human ambit? I really do sense in our time a hunger to reopen this question. When the philosopher Thomas Nagel asked in 1974, what is it like to be a bat? His point was that the question could not be answered from our standpoint, because we're always caught in what it's like to be human, and the gulf is unbridgeable. In 1986, the late writer Barry Lopez labored to imagine the sensorium of a narwhal, a creature that, like a bat, inhabits a landscape of sound, 3 dimensions of vibration, maybe like, in my imagination, one of those old cosmological globes in which circles of perception work outward from the middle, out to the sphere of heaven where creation has its boundary. And Lopez was engaged in a novel literary experiment and trying to carry human consciousness across Nagel's great divide by drawing on our own power to remake our experience through imagination. And today, that literary experiment, I would say, is commonplace, although the results are sometimes dazzling. Many books, many of them fine, invite us to contemplate the inner life of the hawk, the octopus, the elephant, the songbirds, dogs and cats, fungal colonies and forests, to name a few. There's conjecture, and I think the conjecture is itself telling, no comment on whether it will work, that artificial intelligence might be able to reconstruct the languages of whales and other species from the patterns of our recordings, which no human mind could organize. And in law, there's a push to take seriously the idea of nature's rights, sometimes taken as far as to say, for instance, that in deciding whether to build a dam, we have to ask whether the river consents. I think this development in culture can play into environmental politics in 2 opposite ways. On the good side, one of the best things about human beings is our generous curiosity. We can pose questions whose answers will change us. What is it like to be some other life is one of those questions. It should be staggering to us that the world is full of so many kinds of experience, so many standpoints, that we live in a profusion of worlds, the world of the forest, of the bats, of the possums. Taking this on is a real effort to grapple with how we're not alone. On the other hand, there's real danger of projection and escapism. Some Victorians liked to imagine that in a gray industrial world full of human suffering and utilitarian rationalizations of it, there were also fairies in the gardens of the middle classes and aristocrats. I have almost boundless emotional sympathy for that impulse, but I think there's a responsibility to be intellectually and politically skeptical of it, especially if the question is whether it can improve our law and politics. I don't think we know how to say whether a river has consented to a dam, or that we know whether one evocation of a forest experience gets it more right than another. Forests and mushroom colonies have recently been advanced as evidence of the ethical superiority of socialism, libertarianism, even a kind of pull-up-your-pants paternalism, and the trees are not going to tell us which one is really right for them or what it means for us. That we are asking these questions about our place in the world, I find really hopeful. The answers we can finally give will have to be worked out among other human beings, people with whom we will continue to disagree. At best, we will merely continue to disagree. So let's come back to our politics. I said at the beginning that we are at a moment when past experience is no guide to the present. A worse thought would be that the recent experience of relatively fortunate people is not a guide to the future, but that the broader shape of human experience might be. I said it got bleak. That experience has been of vulnerability and domination in political life, scarcity and domination in economic life, and scarcity and uncertainty in relation to the natural world. In each of those domains, for most of human experience, you ultimately had to make your best effort and pray for good rulers and to escape the attention of rulers in any case, to pray for good weather and to pray to avoid predators and plagues. Modern life has been a search for a generalized way out of this situation into a domain of greater freedom. Much of the great modern political debate between left and right, between more democracy and more market, has been over where the domain of freedom is. For libertarians of the right, as Nobel economist Milton Friedman argued in Capitalism and Freedom, the domain of freedom is that of voluntary market relations, with the overreaching, irrational, grasping state kept at a safe distance. For the democratic left, the domain of freedom is in shared decisions among political equals about how to live together, about the value to make decisions about the value of work, the value of learning and rest, the value of the larger living world. In the second vision, people can be the authors of a world that's good for them to inhabit. Notice that in both versions, right and left, there's a conjunction of kinds of freedom: greater agency, greater capacity to set our own projects and direction, a kind of affirmative freedom, but also security, freedom from abuse, freedom from domination, what some would call negative freedom, but I would call a securing or shielding aspect of freedom. Each side of this debate has accused the other of confusing freedom with domination. For the right, the left has romanticized democracy and sometimes community and failed to understand that it's in collectives, especially political collectives, that we're most dangerous to one another. For the left, the right has romanticized the market, failing to recognize that this supposed realm of freedom is structured through and through by private government, unequal bargaining power, and the motive of exploitation, which is not personal but systemic in the pressure to increase return on investment. The bleak thought is, what if each is kind of right about the other? What if there's no privileged domain of freedom that we can generalize as a way of looking out for one another? And what if, for just that reason, we are likely to keep reconstituting the natural world as an increasingly dangerous place, reviving the once ordinary dangers of starving seasons and plagues? In a way, we see the eclipsed market ideal in the carbon trading scheme, bringing the natural world into the logic of a price-mediated mutual benefit system. And we see the democratic ideal in the Green New Deal, which is now also for the moment politically eclipsed, which aimed to decommodify parts of care and work and learning alongside an explicit political judgment about how to honor the value of life in the 21st century. If both ways forward are closed for now, then economy, ecology, and politics all risk becoming, again, ways that we are buffeted by fate, places where we hope for mercy. Here's one more turn on the thought, an even worse one. This is the bleakest part. What if we are making ourselves into people who like to see things burn? There's a standard story of American environmental law in which green legislation comes along after the Cuyahoga River catches fire in 1969, where it runs through Cleveland. What's missing in the standard story is that Americans first had to learn to see a burning river as a crisis, and themselves as able to address the crisis. The Cuyahoga had burned before quite a few times, and it had not been taken as a spur to action. In 1969, it was, drawing on many of the kinds of cultural and political resources that I was talking about. Now suppose it were taken instead as a kind of festival. As a species, we produce gardeners and devoted caretakers, and we also produce arsonists. We can experience a sense of agency and engagement in slow, deliberate, self-limiting kinds of work, or in setting off a spectacle of destruction and watching it burn. If there's money to make in that kind of entertainment and even that kind of politics, the kind that trains us to be arsonists, the training might happen, might be a way to reconcile ourselves to other kinds of incapacity. That's a thought from very late last night. I hope it's wrong. It was the last thing I wrote on the lecture. It seems to me that we can't afford to ignore these possibilities, and also can't afford to surrender to them. There's nothing new about the challenge of holding contradictory thoughts together, but it always feels new because there's no formula. What do I find myself thinking now? I find myself thinking thoughts that are in some ways more conservative than the optimistic and radical call to challenge, for example, the constitutional constraints in our democratic capacity that will very aptly named as part of the argument that I made in 2022, the core of that book, Two Cheers for Politics. Now, trying to think in this moment and to think with great uncertainty in this moment with just a few starting points, I found myself thinking first that there should be no profligate rejection of anything that makes the world more viable and more humane. Examples that come to mind now include due process, the rule of law, free speech, constitutional order, a conservative principle, our federal lands as they now exist, independent institutions such as universities and the professions. There is a first responsibility to preserve the world and a second responsibility to improve it. That is a conservative thought, but not a despairing or reactionary thought. We don't know how to hold these two imperatives in balance, I think. We don't have any complete or even very adequate theory of our collective lives that would tell us just how to hold them in balance. And so the place where we start, with whatever affordances it gives us of peace and capacity, is a kind of gift and a kind of mystery. And this is true even as all our necessary criticism and qualification of our starting place is also true. And even our criticism begins from our experience of what's good and asking why there can't be more of it. More good work, more fellowship, more safety, more care. So we take the first measure of criticism from what we've learned to appreciate. That is a conservative impulse. I think it's one that helps to show even the most radical ambition in its best light. By that token, I'm very grateful now for every park, every community garden and little farm, every piece of education that prompts children or adults to think in terms of cardinal directions and watersheds, of land history, its many relationships to human history. This is the ground that ecological politics has to come back to again and again. Maybe to venture out into the politics of food and human health and land health, maybe into new dimensions of climate justice. These kinds of ecological work and imagination are how democracy learns how to make a safe and lasting home in this world. And democracy is how ecological imagination begins to become real. They need one another, and they're both fragile now. That's what I have to say. Let's start talking. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Jed. Have a seat, relax, and let's have a conversation. Really forgot to add the word poet to my description, I believe, but that was a beautiful lecture. As wide-ranging as I hoped.
Pick up my things. I think outdoors people
Take your jacket off the floor.
They call it a yard sale, outdoors people. When you fall down a hill and your gear is screwing all down the slope.
That happens. A lot of issues raised. I'm not going to start the question. Let's get started. Hand up. Go for it. Good to see you.
So as you had mentioned for that, I should say one thing about President Goodall uses the Raphael zero my thought of the moment. Yeah. And I want to take a Polanyi thought, or it's just Polanyi thought, about where you end. Because one of the things about democracy is that it can be unhoused. And Polanyi's dominant thought about the economy, right, was it needed to be embedded in enduring institutions. So does democracy. That there's a kind of libertarian or even a radical democracy thought that is anti-institution, and that one of the thoughts, I don't know of your books, but certainly an article of yours, you say law is an infrastructure. And I think that thought has been absent from our conversations. That the kind of institutions we need, and everything about the Trumpian world is the destruction of institutions. And Democrats often think, no, no, give us back the power, everything will be okay. And I think that's wrong too. That what we lack is an institutional imagination in which the law, why would law be an infrastructure? And I take it, but not at least remembering that law is an ethical infrastructure. That is, it gives us a set of shared norms that's transgenerational. It's how we communicate our norms of policies on in ways that allow community to build. So it seems, and why I'm pushing all of this, because the notion of democracy you mentioned is actually not a source of trust. It's a form of expression and a form of power and a form of freedom, but it's not a form of trust. And what it seems to me is that what we require is an infrastructure that builds trust. So that's what I thought was missing in your aid. That trust seems to be the ground phenomenon. And unless you have the institutional resources for it, then it goes missing.
Yeah.
So Eleanor Ostrom's work,
Yeah.
the obvious economic example. Yeah. That's why she wanted those forms of democracy, right? Because they were structured with trust community. So it's not the democracy itself we need formation of it, but allow trust